guess it's quite rare really that you find as a theologian someone whose life is as exciting as their theology, and when it comes to Bonhoeffer, what we see is someone who lives through the climactic events of the 20th century and who does theology within that context and also theology about that context. As an individual, I guess I was particularly interested in the way that Bonhoeffer thought about the conditions of post-Christendom, the situation that the church found itself in of being weak, a situation where secularism had run rife. And rather than simply capitulating ground as a theologian to secularism or hurling grenades as a fundamentalist or something, Bonhoeffer actually thinks theologically about a situation in which he finds himself and declares not simply that the world has come of age in secularism, but that the world has come of age in Jesus Christ. As a younger man, I found that idea absolutely captivating, and his devotional works on discipleship as well I found utterly thrilling and enthralling. The idea of a theologian who was deeply interested in a life of faith and a life of commitment, a theologian who in the end would pay the ultimate price for that life of faith and that life of commitment to Jesus Christ. Okay, Bonhoeffer was born in 1906 in Breslau, which was at that time in Germany, in the Kaiser's Germany. It's now in Poland, but he moved in 1912 to Berlin. His father was an eminent psychiatrist and took up a position at the University of Berlin. He seems to have been quite a sort of patriarchal father in lots of ways, somebody who was very concerned about the way in which his children thought, encouraged them to have critical and rational minds, but nevertheless someone who showed his approval to his family. Bonhoeffer was born into a large family. He was one of 8 children. His birth was accompanied by the birth of a twin sister that he was just a few minutes older than, Sabina. And the family were very close. They were a typical intellectual family in lots of ways. Their mother was from an aristocratic background and a background of theologians. His father was from an upper middle class professional and intellectual background. And it was a family filled with conversation, filled with debate, a family which was very lively and a family which played together and thought together. Bonhoeffer wasn't born into a particularly religious family, interestingly. His mother did nurture the faith of their children and they were all baptised, but his father thought it was a very strange decision for him to be a theologian, and his brothers and his father in fact teased him about it and tried to discourage him from it when at 14 Bonhoeffer announced that he was going to be a theologian. They explained that this was an outmoded and outdated institution, and Bonhoeffer bravely and boldly said that he was going to change it then, and I suspect he has done in terms of the reception of his theology. As a family, they were very conscious of their place and position within society. They were part of the intellectual scene of Berlin. Their neighbours included people like von Harnack, the famous historian of Christianity. And Bonhoeffer, as well as being a great academic and a promising and precociously gifted young man, was also an amazingly talented pianist, and at one stage did consider a life as a pianist and as a professional musician. Bonhoeffer's idyllic background, I guess, was disrupted, like many people's, at the start of the 20th century by the First World War. And very sadly, his brother Walter was mortally injured in the First World War and died. And Bonhoeffer was given his copy of the Bible, which he kept with him for the remainder of his life. That had a profound effect on the young Bonhoeffer, and I suspect it's a remarkable indicator of the man that he ultimately became a pacifist and was so involved in the end in trying to set up peaceful negotiations with the Allies in the Second World War. Bonhoeffer engaged in his theological studies initially at the University of Tübingen in Germany. As I suspect many people know, one studies in more than one university, and he went from Tübingen, which is where his brothers and his father had studied, to Berlin to complete his studies there. He was one of von Harnack's favourites and in fact engaged in discourse with von Harnack for a good number of years after he finished his studies. At a relatively young age, he completed his licentiate in theology, which is our equivalent of a doctorate, with his book Sanctorum Communio. And then following that, he was ordained as a pastor in the German Lutheran Church and went to be the associate pastor to the German-speaking congregations in Barcelona. He then returned to his academic career and completed his second doctoral thesis, this doctoral thesis that's necessary in Germany if you want to be an academic teacher. And he did that on Act and Being, an investigation into revelation, and particularly taking seriously the thought of Karl Barth, whose work he'd become very enamoured with. After that, he went to do a postdoctoral fellowship in New York at Union Theological Seminary. It's quite fascinating, really, because Bonhoeffer, in many ways, was extremely disappointed at the quality of theology that took place in New York. He thought a good deal of it to be thin, although he was impressed with people like Niebuhr, who he came across during that time. However, while he found elements of theology disappointing, it's the time in New York which in many ways marks Bonhoeffer's movement from being a theologian to being a churchman. Bonhoeffer had thought about and written about the nature of the church, and yet in some ways his life of discipleship and his life of faith really sort of gets a kickstart during his time in New York, and he's particularly impressed with the black Christians that he comes across there. And he spends his time not only at Riverside Church, next to Union Theological Seminary, where he was sort of expected to go, but also at the Black Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. And he's very impressed with a number of people that he meets in that context. He returned from New York to Berlin and began teaching as a lecturer in the University of Berlin as a Privatdozent, which is effectively a sort of lecturer who lectures for free, where you serve your apprenticeship as a lecturer in Germany. And he taught a number of courses, some of which we now have in terms of student notes, things like the Christology lectures, not Bonhoeffer's own words, but the records that his students kept of it. And we also have his lectures, Creation and Fall, from that period of time as well. During his time in Berlin, there was the rise of the Nazi Party that took place, and I guess much of Bonhoeffer's subsequent life is thought about in terms of that context. Bonhoeffer was prophetic in his recognition of the dangers of the concept of the Führer and the dangers of Adolf Hitler, and even before Hitler was announced as Reichschancellor in 1933, Bonhoeffer was being broadcast on the dangers of the Führer concept for young Germans. In fact, the broadcast was so difficult and dangerous for the people at the time that it was cut short, and we don't have the completed version of that. But Bonhoeffer already recognised some of the dangers that took place. And I guess it's that aspect of his life that, more than anything, he's remembered for. He spent his remaining time variously engaged in opposing Hitler and Hitler's regime. Interestingly, he seems to have followed in his grandmother's shoes with regard to that. His grandmother was a woman who knew her own mind, and despite being 90, barged past stormtroopers to go and shop in the Jewish shop where she'd always shopped. And these befuddled men carrying guns, looked at her and she said, "I will do my shopping where I always do my shopping." Bonhoeffer seems to have got a degree of that sort of bravery from his grandmother, and indeed was very outspoken about the circumstances and situations that the Jewish people found themselves in the 1930s in Germany, and famously said, "Only he who shouts for the Jews can sing the Gregorian chants." That's not to say that Bonhoeffer's life was straightforwardly the life of a saint. He was himself haunted by the fact that he refused to take his sister's father-in-law's funeral, since his sister's father-in-law was Jewish, and that placed him in a difficult circumstance. However, he was later involved in rescuing Jews, including his brother-in-law, but he was more famously, I guess, involved in Operation 7, where he rescued 14 Jews and smuggled them out of Germany through his own efforts. Having been a pastor in London for a period of time, pastoring German congregations there, Bonhoeffer returned, partly at the urging of Barth, in fact, to Berlin, and then ultimately to Finkenwalde, where he set up an illegal seminary for the Confessing Church. The Confessing Church was an organisation that had opposed the Reichskirche in Germany and had recognised some of the dangers of the state interference in the church. And they set themselves up as an opposition to that, not outside of the church, but believing that they were the true continuation of the German Protestant church, and that it was those people who had denied the Old Testament and denied the validity of Paul's writings, and who were engaging in anti-Semitic laws and following this sort of Führer concept, where Jesus, rather than being seen as somebody who was weak and suffered, was seen instead as being a hero or an archetype of the Führer. And it was the confessing church that sought to oppose and was active in opposing the situation, the political situation in Germany through those years. Bonhoeffer was instrumental in leading this community in Finkenwalde, which trained ministers to pastor congregations for the confessing church. It wasn't always all that successful, I guess, Bonhoeffer's leadership of the seminary. Some people thought him rather popish. In Germany at the time, one didn't really engage in seminarian training. So you went to university, you took your theology exams, and then effectively you became almost a sort of civil servant as a church minister. Bonhoeffer, inspired by what he'd seen in Rome and actually by what he'd seen in Britain as well, set up a situation which sought to form ministers. And it was a situation in which ministers lived together as part of their training, and they learned the pattern of worship. They even were encouraged to engage in public confessions. A number of people at the seminary were rather uncomfortable with that idea as Protestants, but Bonhoeffer led by example and confessed to his own students, in fact, as well. It's through those years that Bonhoeffer worked upon what is, I guess, his most famous book, the book Discipleship, which was published in 1937. Discipleship was made very popular after the war in Britain and in America by Bishop Bell, who had become a great friend of Bonhoeffer's during his time pastoring the Germans in London. And it was popularised under the title The Cost of Discipleship, a reflection, I guess, on Bonhoeffer's own end as a martyr during World War II. However, that couldn't have been anticipated when Bonhoeffer did write the book himself. Instead, what Bonhoeffer was concerned with was the fact that Protestant ideas about grace and Lutheran ideas about grace couldn't be cheapened, couldn't simply be an excuse for people not to stand up for their faith or not to live a life of discipleship. And so he